So you all know that we're living in extremely challenging times for all kinds of reasons. And because our species is facing so many multiple crises at the same time, it has begun to dawn on most intelligent, sophisticated, thoughtful, sensitive people that we're entering a completely different time of history. Many of us have begun to realize that there's no way back to the extremely secure period of human history between the late 50s and the early 2000s. We're in a very different time. We're in the middle of a time of breakdown, a time of great concern for our individual and collective futures. It's become obvious that the future is going to be enormously difficult for many, many, many people and for the environment. And for those of us who have the courage to face into the truth, it's extremely frightening and emotionally, psychologically, personally, collectively, philosophically, and metaphysically, completely overwhelming if we really begin to look closely at the truth of the facts of what we're facing. But what I want to talk about is if it's true that we're in a period of potential collapse, what is the right perspective? What is the right attitude? What is the appropriate inner posture in relationship to such an unusual time in human history that is going to affect all of us in one way or another, unavoidably? And it is the impending reality of total insecurity that I'm speaking about. So, of course, we all like to think that the world space that we're living in is safe and secure. And it's natural and understandable that we would be expecting that, because that's how the world has been for a lot of us for most of our lives. So many of us have gotten used to privileges, comforts, and possibilities of human experience that most human beings could never even have imagined. Most of us have been able to travel anywhere we wanted to go, do anything we could think of, really. Most of us have probably never starved, never had to worry about where our next meal was going to come from, and have been afforded a high level of education. So most of us on this call are probably among the luckiest people that have ever been born. And we've gotten used to things being pretty good. And why not? So most of us have never lived through a war. We've never lived through a period of collapse and real existential challenges, the likes of which we are facing now. So I don't want to talk about why we're in this mess, because I'm sure you all have your own ideas about it. And I'm certainly not an expert. But the question is, if we are those who are interested in spiritual enlightenment, spiritual liberation, awakening to the highest truths from the highest perspective, what is the most appropriate attitude in relationship to the existential challenges that we're all facing? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. Because we're all going to have all kinds of thoughts and feelings about what's happening and about what's going to happen as it happens. And I think how we're going to be responding emotionally, psychologically, and even spiritually is unpredictable, because none of us know how we're going to react and how we're going to respond to a crisis until the crisis actually befalls us. That's how we find out that's how we all find out what we're made of, when the rubber hits the road in our lives. So what's difficult about this situation is, as other thinkers have pointed out, we're facing a potential for a kind of total insecurity collapse and destruction on a level that's probably pretty close to historically unprecedented. And so I think a big part of a real spiritual practice is cultivating a moral, philosophical, and metaphysical framework that will help us to keep our balance and to remain strong in the face of the overwhelming challenges that lie ahead. Because the thing about huge challenges that frighten us is that they test our deepest convictions about the nature of life and death and about the meaning and purpose of existence. So one of the things I try and do in my teaching work, and it's a big part of my own practice, is to teach myself and to teach other people how to think big, how to think with big perspectives, big inclusive perspectives that can hold a lot of complexity. So we can learn how to see anything and everything that occurs within our inner experience and all around us in the world that we're living in, from the biggest vantage points and the biggest perspectives possible. Now, in our deepest moments, in our deepest and highest moments, in our moments of greatest insight, and especially during moments of revelation, it becomes apparent to us that we're part and parcel of a process that way transcends the immediacy of the present moment and whatever may be seeming to be happening in our present circumstances. We become aware of a context that's literally infinite, vast, extraordinary, miraculous, and profound. And that's when the life-changing revelation occurs, when we begin to awaken to a context that's no longer relative, but one that is absolute. So it's this moment in the experience of revelation when that which is relative is recognized to be merely and only relative, that is so life-changing, and then that only happens when we awaken to a context that's not relative, but that's absolute. Until we see the relative in the context of the absolute, the relative context always seems like that is all there is. It's all consuming. The relative context appears to us most of the time as being absolutely and totally real, and there's nothing beyond it, nothing true or more real. But when we awaken to a transcendental absolute context, suddenly the relative is seen for what it is, that which is merely relative, or that which is only relatively real. And when we see that which is relatively real in the context of that which is absolutely real, it's always profoundly and inherently liberating beyond measure. So the challenge here is, can we see even this extraordinary experiment of life on planet Earth in the context of that which is relatively real? I'm not saying it's not real, but I'm saying what's happening here in this process outside of an absolute context is merely relatively real and not absolutely real. So can we see this experiment that's occurring here on planet Earth, this experiment of life, as a small, extraordinary experiment in a vast, unlimited cosmos? And can we begin to understand that what happens here is not the beginning or the end of anything? But can we begin to grasp that this process that gave birth to life on planet Earth is infinite, especially from the perspective of revelation. There are no beginnings and there's no endings and there's no such thing as death. So this is the biggest perspective that there is, as far as I understand, as far as I know. And can we awaken enough to always be on some level cognizant of the fact that God, or the absolute principle that created the universe and is creating the universe right now, always infinitely transcends that which she created and is constantly giving rise to. because that is the highest truth. So the way not to get caught, not to get trapped, is to realize that again and again and again and again, and to remember that again and again and again and again. Not so we would, not in any way so that we would avoid and deny anything that's true. I'm not talking about spiritual bypassing at all. I'm speaking about teaching ourselves through dedicated spiritual practice of meditation and profound contemplation, to awaken to this infinite context again and again and again and again, and to reawaken to this infinite context again and again and again, until it's not so far away from our awareness. Not to escape, but to be awake. So this perspective, this highest truth, is something that we all need to work on through dedicated spiritual practice, through hard spiritual work. Because if we're truly to become enlightened men and women, this highest truth needs to become the meta context for all of our human experience. So what I'm speaking about now, as I've been saying, is the highest vantage point that I know of. And in order to realize it and to be able to stabilize ourselves in any way in relationship to it, it requires an enormous degree of letting go of all of our relative attachments. It requires enormous courage, spiritual ambition, to really let go of it all. Because if we can truly let go of it all, we will find the most stable place that exists in the universe and beyond the universe, and that's the place we want to have access to as much as we possibly can. So this is the highest vantage point and the highest perspective, and we'll talk about that more. But then there's a relative perspective, which is equally important. And the relative perspective, which is equally important, has very much to do with how the ego, your ego, my ego, your frontal self, my frontal self, our frontal self, the frontal personality, our human personality, our flawed and fragile, vulnerable, sensitive, at times intelligent, loving personality is going to get through this. So a big part of spiritual work is, as you all know, learning how to transcend the ego. Not easy, everybody talks about it. It's hard work. Few of us really succeed in getting that far with the transcendence process, because it's so damn hard and such a big deal, and it's so hard to see. But the ego in you and the ego in me is very fickle. The ego has good days and the ego has bad days. The ego has good days and the ego has bad days. The true self and the authentic self never has a bad day. The true self and the authentic self always sees the sun that always lays beyond the clouds. But the ego has good days and bad days. And a bad day is when those clouds are very thick and it can't seem to see beyond them. On a good day, the ego will be your best friend, our best friend, everybody's best friend, and on a bad day, the ego will be our worst enemy and your worst enemy. In a charged spiritual context, in a spiritually charged and vibrant spiritual context, the transition, the metamorphosis that we're seeking to accomplish is getting the ego to move from a very selfish, self-centered, self-concerned, narcissistic orientation to the experience of life where it cares largely only about itself and its own feelings, its own desires, its own fears, and its own concerns, to when it begins to care about other things, much bigger things. So the ego's a problem because of its narcissistic, inwardly focused self-concern. And it's a very hard thing to overcome, which means I care about me, not about you, not about us. I care about me, not about you, not about us. I care about me, I don't care about the environment. I care about me, I don't care about life, really. So the most beautiful thing to witness is when someone, in the process of waking up, transcending the small self, begins to discover higher care. When they stop when they wake up from the relentless inner hypnosis of being constantly fascinated and focus on their own self-concern, and begin to care about other things, like other people, about animals, about nature, about life. So one way to describe this ego transcending process is going from self-concern to higher care. And in the past, I've often challenged people saying, how much do you really care? How much do you really care? Because I think a test of how liberated our heart and our soul and our mind truly is can be clearly and easily recognized by witnessing how much the other person actually really cares. In my own work, I've noticed it's a Herculean transformation to see someone make the transition from egoic self-concern to awakening to a care for consciousness itself. I care more about consciousness than I do about the small self. That's a huge leap. So the question is, how much do you care? How much do I care? How much do we care? And that is one of the biggest spiritual questions in relationship to what we're talking about today, is how much do you care? What is your capacity to care dependent upon? And when is it when you stop caring? Because everybody's got a threshold. I don't care anymore. I'm so sorry. I just don't care. I don't care is the signature of the unenlightened ego when it's gone to hell. So from a certain point of view, we could say that when we care absolutely about life, about love, about consciousness, about other people, about all sentient beings, about truth, meaning, purpose, when we begin to care desperately and passionately about all those things, we're spiritually conscious. Think about some of our greatest modern saints, people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. What was so remarkable about them was their public demonstration of how much they actually cared. They cared so much that they put their own life at risk over and over and over again because they cared more than they were concerned about their own safety and their own welfare. That's a sign of higher consciousness. So how much do you care? How much do I care? How much do we care? That's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And so what I wanted to say was that when life puts pressure on us, it challenges our capacity to care with a very big heart, with a big soul, and with a big mind. And when we become frightened and overwhelmed and confused, our capacity to care generally deteriorates. And if you'll notice, when you get very frightened, when you get very frustrated, when you get very angry, when you get very victimized, you suddenly realize that you don't give a damn. And when you begin to not give a damn anymore, that's when you become dangerous. That's when we become dangerous. I just don't give a damn. So think about it. Think about yourself. Think about your relationship to your own mind, your own feelings, your relationship to philosophical principles and moral principles, to meaning and purpose, and to the experience of life. How much do you care? And how much is your capacity for care dependent upon how you feel on any particular day? So caring is the expression of enlightened awareness. Deep and profound caring is an act of enlightened awareness. So what I want you all to kind of to think about for a minute is that caring, in the way that I'm speaking about it, is kind of like a spiritual obligation. When you wake up, you find that you do care, and caring will make your life more challenging, because the more you care, the more responsibility you will embrace, you'll take on, you will embody. So the more you care, the more you're going to be carrying on your own shoulders, not just for your own sake, but for everyone else's sake. And you'll be doing it because you feel you have no choice, not because you should. You find you're doing it because you have no choice. So notice that, to notice that when things get very difficult, and when we're under a lot of pressure, for whatever reason, when we feel we're under a lot of existential pressure, emotional pressure, psychological pressure, moral pressure, philosophical pressure, sometimes we feel it's just too much. This is just too much. Whatever it is, maybe we're sick. Maybe somebody we love is sick. Maybe we've lost our money in a bad investment. Maybe somebody's betrayed us. Maybe we've done something very stupid. Whatever the reason doesn't matter. The point I'm trying to make is that the ego has a breaking point. And when the ego breaks in the wrong kind of way, it no longer cares. And even worse, it doesn't care that it doesn't care. So when you care, you feel responsible, and you make the effort to be careful and mindful, because you realize the stakes are very high when we live a conscious life. So when you know when you're aspiring to live a conscious life, you make the effort to be more careful, to be more kind, and to be more thoughtful. But when caring becomes too much of a strain on the frontal self, on the person, and the ego, and the personality, when the strain gets to be too much, I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore. We get to the point when we feel we're about to break, and then when we break, we realize that we don't care. And the interesting part of all this, and the terrible part of it, is that when the ego doesn't care anymore, when the ego feels I don't have to care anymore, it feels liberated from all moral and spiritual and even personal obligations. Because when you care, you've got to follow the rules. You have to be true. You have to be righteous. You have to be you have to be enlightened. You have to be a righteous soul if you care. And if you care that you care, and if you know how important caring is. But when you don't care anymore, and you don't care that you don't care, all that falls away. You're free. You don't have to give a damn about anything. And so this is what I call a state of unfreedom or negative freedom. Positive freedom is the freedom to care. Negative freedom is the freedom not to have to care. And the ego, when people have a breakdown, it's very, from a certain point of view, a certain perspective, it's very liberating, because you don't have to care anymore, and you don't have to be responsible, because you have decided that it's all too much. And when it all becomes too much for you, then we can decide to give up. And when we give ourselves the freedom to give up, or the option of giving up, and we take that option, it's like a huge burden falls off our shoulders, in the wrong way, for the wrong reasons, of course. But it's like a huge weight we've been carrying falls away. The weight of all the responsibility, the weight of righteousness and purposefulness and higher consciousness and truth, love, meaning, purpose, and morals and philosophical principles, all falls away. Now we're free not to care. My definition of evil is not caring, but not caring, and even worse, not caring that we don't care. So try and feel, when I say I don't care and I don't care that I don't care, try to feel in that the negative freedom inherent in that position. It's very liberating for your ego, for the small self, for the part of ourself we want to be free from, if we want to awaken. So what does this all have to do with what the subject of this talk is? Because none of us know what's going to happen in the future, but it's not looking good. It's looking like it's going to be, as I was saying, enormously challenging, overwhelming, terrifying, and frightening. And so what I wanted to advocate was, can we all work spiritually on ourselves with great diligence and great purposefulness, so that we will not be broken by whatever happens. It's easier said than done. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what my own breaking point is either. So can we work to cultivate a kind of inner strength and inner conviction that's unbreakable? No matter what's happening in our outer life, no matter what's happening in the real world, and in the life that we're living, no matter what's happening, can we strive to become unbreakable in relationship to our highest principles, our highest moral, philosophical, and metaphysical principles, no matter what? Easier said than done. So despair, destruction, ruination, and loss understandably give rise to feelings of nihilism. And can we work to gain such an access to this highest truth, to the highest truth, that could so spiritually empower us that we would never be tempted by nihilism ever again, no matter how bad things got? No matter how bad things got, no matter how bad things get, can we become so firmly established in the highest truth that we can never be tempted by nihilism and the relative freedom that nihilism affords us ever again? Because that's the spiritual solution, that we never lose faith. That we never lose faith in the highest truth. no matter what happens in the real world of relative reality, which we are always consciously and unconsciously participating in, may we never lose faith. And not blind faith, but faith that's based upon profound revelation, direct experience of higher consciousness. Can our inner confidence be stronger than whatever the outer reality may actually be? Easier said than done. When everything is falling apart, can we remain cognizant and conscious of who we really are and where we really are and what's actually happening in the biggest context? Easier said than done. But I think that's the spiritual challenge at hand for all of us. You have to remember that the truth can be lost when people forget about it. So a significant part of the awakening process has always been, and will always be, bearing witness. Bearing witness to the highest truth that you have seen and that you have known, bearing witness. So when everybody else, for understandable human reasons, falls into forgetfulness, will you be so firmly established in this higher perspective that you won't forget and that you'll still be able to bear witness? Because again, remember, the truth can be forgotten. It has been. For the universe to remember its own deepest truths, it needs awakened human beings to bear witness to it. That's the whole point of evolutionary enlightenment. And what's so unique and significant about it is the role that the awakening human plays in the evolutionary process. And in the evolutionary context, there's the all-important recognition that the evolutionary process bears witness to itself and awakens to itself in the highly complex, self-reflective mind of the awakening human. So I'm not only speaking about bearing witness to evolution, to the progress that the cosmos is making, but to the deepest and highest truth, which means the ultimate identity of this whole process. Will we be here to bear witness when others are forgetting? Because otherwise this miraculous self-knowledge, knowledge of the self, will be forgotten. When things start going wrong, generally what happens is the consciousness of the collective spirals downward into survival mode. And when we're concerned mainly with survival and not with evolving, we tend to forget these higher principles and higher truths. So at higher levels of development, what makes life worth living, what makes the experience of life feel like it's worth living at higher levels of development is not comfort, it's not material comfort, but it's self-knowledge. So when you get frightened, watch your mind and see how in moments of weakness, understandable weakness, that the ego is begging for the freedom to let go of caring. And when you let go of caring, you don't have to be responsible anymore because you feel it's not your problem. And that's the definition of hell. When things start going wrong, caring is much harder. It's spiritually so much more demanding. So much more demanding for the soul. But that's the work at hand. to care more than anything else, in spite of what may be going wrong. I heard Jamie Wheel give a talk about the same subject about 6 months ago on YouTube. And I remember it struck me very deeply when he said, what the spiritual quality that we need to cultivate in this particular time in history is courage. That we all have to find the courage to be strong in the face of overwhelming insecurity. But I think at the same time we need to protect our own hearts, do the spiritual work necessary to protect our own hearts, and refuse to break in the face of the enormous temptation to do so.